Hi, I'm Stavris, owner of DrumChops.com. I'd like to welcome you to another segment of Basic Drums. In this segment, what I'd like to do is show you how to go ahead and put on a new drum head on the top of your snare drum. Now, the technique that I'm going to use for putting on the head and tuning the drum is the same that you would use for putting on heads on top and bottom of toms and bass drums as well. The tuning is going to be done in what we call a star pattern. And I think you'll find that the techniques that I use here are going to serve you well with all the rest of your drums. We'll get into a little bit of specifics about the snare drum in general, and a little bit about the inside of the drum once we get the head off. So for right now, let's go ahead and start by just taking a look at what makes a snare drum different from a tom. On the other side of the bass, of the snare drum, what you'll find is a set of what we call snares. They're wire strands that are attached to metal strips on either side, and then those strips are either fastened with either pieces of plastic, like you see here, or what they call snare cord, which is similar to a heavy-duty string. And what that does is that puts tension on the snares so that they press up against the bottom of the snare head. Now, the heads on the snare drum, you'll find that the bottom head is typically much thinner than the top head, and usually much thinner than any other head that you'll use. It's a single ply head, and the reason for it being so thin is so that it can take the vibration of the snares and make them vibrate more to give you that real snare crisp sound. Generally, the tighter you make the bottom head and the tighter you make the snares against it, the more of a tight sound that you'll have, all the way to the extremes of what you might hear in a parade drum or a drum corps drum, where the heads are extremely tight. This is more of a jazz pop style drum. It's a 5.5 inch by 14, so you'll notice that the snares are in place. Now, you'll also notice that along the inside of the shell of the drum, where you would go to have the snare wire or piece of plastic, in this case, run down through into the mounting hardware, there's going to be a little indentation, and that's called the snare bed. And it's really important that when you go to look at a drum, that those snare beds are in place, and they're in the right place, and they're cut right. If they're not, it will make it very difficult to get a very good sound out of that snare drum. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put the snare on the stand, and then we'll remove the top head, and then we'll pick up from there with how to go about checking the head, seating it, and then putting the rim back on, and then getting the drum tensioned up and tuned. Okay, so our drum head has been removed, our top head, and we're just going to take a little inspection of the inside of the shell. And we're going to see that on the inside of the drum, what we have across the top is called a bearing edge. And you'll notice that there's a slight indentation that they call the bearing edge, where it sort of has a little point to it and goes down. Every drum will have a slightly different angle that the bearing edge is at, and where it really does matter is that as this is angled and you have more of a sharp point, there's actually less shell touching the head, and that gives you more of a resonant sound, more ability to ring, because the drum is more free to vibrate with less shell actually touching it. Shells will come in various thicknesses, in various kinds of wood, and for right now what we need to consider is just what this bearing edge looks like, and the fact that the bearing edge is true, meaning that it's not going to be warped or out of round in any way. That will definitely cause an impact on the sound of the drum, and it would make it much more difficult to tune. Also on the snare drum, we saw on the bottom where we did have the snares, there's also the snare throw-off that I want to point out. And what this is simply is that it's a mechanism where you can bring it down and allow the snares to loosen up on the bottom head, and that will take the snare drum and move it into more of a, instead of having the snares against the bottom head where they would vibrate and you would get a snare drum sound, making the throw-off release the snares will give the snare drum a more of a tom-tom sound, because the snares won't be touching the bottom head and they won't be able to vibrate, giving you the snare sound. That will come into play as we do our tuning, because a lot of times you want to try and tune with the tom-tom sound and then adjust the snare tension to get the snare sound that you're looking for. Okay, so as you can see, I've already removed the top head, and what we're going to do now is we're going to simply take a look at that head and figure out how we want to get it back on. The head I'm using on this drum is a Remo head. It's called a Renaissance, and I found that it had a good sound for this particular drum. I don't use this head on every single snare drum that I own. Every drum sort of has its own unique qualities. Finding the right head for your drum could be a little bit of a hunt and peck kind of thing. You know, you may need to try a couple things and see what's going to give you the right sound. On DrumChops.com, we do have a drum head selection guide where I make some recommendations for snare drum heads, as well as heads for tom-toms and bass drums. And I do recommend that you take a look at that, and we'll give you the URL for that. Again, go to DrumChops.com and look for a drum head selection guide, and that will help you out. So basically, the first thing that I do when I take a look at a new head that I took out, is I just sort of run my fingers along the outside, around the perimeter, and make sure that the head is seated very well into the metal rim that's attached to the head. You want to make sure that there's no slits there, that there's no elongations on one side rather than the other, indicating that the head was not manufactured correctly. You also want to make sure that the drum head sits flat, that it hasn't been bent or anything in any shipping or anything like that. This looks like a solid head, so what I'm going to go ahead and do is seat it on top of the drum. Now you'll notice that there is a little bit of slack here. So what you want to do is you want to seat it in such a way so that you're sort of centered. You want the drum head to be centered. You don't want it to be all in one, all to the right or all to the left, because that will give it the most true sound that you can get, where the actual bearing edge is touching the right spot on the head all the way along. Once your head is seated on top of the drum shell, then the next thing you would do is pick up your rim. These rims happen to be gold-plated die-cast rims, which are more expensive. Usually you would find triple-flanged chrome rims, and those are good too. Matter of fact, some drums I think actually sound better with those. The die-cast rims are harder. They're more dense in terms of the fact that they're not going to bend as easy, and they're heavier. Again, they sound great on certain drums. Other drums I prefer the triple-flanged rims. But you'll notice that the rim will have a series of holes through it. And what you need to do is you need to line up these holes with the lugs on the snare drum. Again, this will go for any drum that you're using. Here we're using a snare drum, and we'll notice that we have a 10-lug snare. So these would be considered your lugs, and your rim with the holes would sit on top of the drum head and line up against those lugs.
This concludes part 1 of lesson 3, basic drums. Look for lesson 2 at YouTube channel AZDrum Chops.